this clunky thing. Hi, everybody. It's wonderful to see you all. So, can you all hear me? Testing, etc. Oh, well, I guess we won't know then until we hear from someone on the internet. Oh, good. Oh, all right. We are in business. Okay. So, when I first started reading The Fountainhead, at the tender age of actually 15, I was quite certain, reading those first lines, that Howard Roark was about to kill himself. I mean, there he is, this man stands naked, laughing, upright, at the edge of a cliff, with no burden, no guilt. There's only one way a scene like that could possibly go from all of my prior reading of modern and historical literature. And much like Dominique in the novel, I continued to harbor ominous expectations of Roark's inevitable doom as I continued to read, and found myself surprised at every turn, and really struck by just how bizarrely different this novel was turning out to be, and the story, the character arc of this idealist, this uncompromising, principled character, not at all like the fate met by his seeming spiritual brothers and sisters in any other work that I had encountered up to that point. In truth, I was pretty depressed myself at the time, as I think many of us could relate at 15 and 16. I was desperately searching for an ideal that I could actually emulate, that I could actually embody, because I really felt myself caught in a deep way between two seemingly untenable ways of life. I could choose the way of the stodgy, unpopular, frustrated and frustrating, hyper-intellectual, too serious, young idealist Gena, who would get in trouble for speaking up too much in class and rocking the boat. Or I could be like everyone else. I could dumb myself down. I could be the kind of happy-go-lucky, practical, kind of status-seeking, soulless zombie that it seemed to pass for a happy person all around me. And neither of these contented me. As I read The Fountainhead, I discovered that this was a false dichotomy. Roark's idealism didn't come, as it turned out, at the cost of his practical success or his happiness. On the contrary, it was ultimately the source of them, the fountainhead, if you will, of his really deep, profound, enduring happiness, and of his really tremendous, objective, existential success, right, in his field, and I would say broadly in his life. Kind of seeing the logical progression of events whereby Roark's insistence on building his buildings his way, despite initially resulting in expulsion, which seemed unthinkable to me as I was getting ready to apply, to all the prestigious colleges, despite his having to do hard labor in a quarry, which seemed much more bothersome to Dominique as it was to me than, it seemed to be for him at the time, given this perspective that he had, because I think he knew what I came to understand more and more, which was that by the logic of what he was doing, how he was approaching his life, and the nature of the world around him, his kind of clients were going to resonate with precisely the uncompromising integrity of his buildings, with what he finds beautiful and functional and sort of necessary, right, to embody in his work. They would find him, and they did. More and more of them, right, came to him, and he got to build more and more complex, challenging, inspiring projects. And in the process, he made friends with people who enriched his life and with whom he didn't have to dumb himself down. He didn't have to play a part. And seeing all of this, seeing that progression, kind of right alongside Dominique, I came to glimpse this idea that maybe this ideal was achievable. And not only that, but eminently worth achieving. that this was really something to unconflictedly strive for, and that I didn't have to trade off my happiness against my virtue, that maybe one is actually the source of the other, and they go hand in hand. This had a lot to do with the nature and the origin of his ideals, which were quite different than any I'd encountered up to that point. The reason he didn't compromise on his building designs and didn't let them get kind of butchered by adding a portico here or a Renaissance flair over there. But it's not out of loyalty to some higher purpose, right? Remember, it's the most selfish thing you've ever seen a man do, he says, when he turns down that Manhattan Bank building commission. It's precisely in service of his own well-being, of his own life, his own happiness, which he can see the causal progression by which he would become a broken man, and his work would suffer, and his life, his joy would suffer if he bent on those principles, right? There's no conflict there. The ideal is an ideal of personal fulfillment, of one's own life fully, joyfully lived. And it turned out that this was the noblest, most demanding ideal of all. Seeing Roark's dedication to his own fully lived life inspired the same kind of dedication in me, as I know it's inspired the same in many of you sitting here, as it inspired that young composer, right, who is riding his bicycle when he sees the Monadnock Valley resort that Roark is building, and he gains the courage to face a lifetime. In retrospect, I think I was one of the young people that Rand describes in her introduction to I think it's the 1968 edition of the Fountainhead, when she writes, whatever their future, at the dawn of their lives, men seek a noble vision of man's nature and of man's potential, and of life's potential. There are very few guideposts to find. The Fountainhead is one of them. Now, some 2-ish decades later, please don't do the math, after my first fateful reading of many of the Fountainhead, I am a scholar and a practicing psychologist dedicating my life to understanding and promoting what I believe to be the essence of that ideal that inspired me as a teenager. And I've come to call it the builder's mindset, for short, largely in tribute to a literal builder, right? Howard Roark, who got me started on this path. The key to understanding Roark's distinct approach to life is that he is primarily a builder, not just in the literal sense of, he's an architect, he's building buildings, but I think also in a much broader and more universal sense, that he approaches his life as a project of building, as something that he is responsible for building, for shaping, according to his chosen and desired image. That is his focus. It's his MO. As by contrast, for example, with people like Ellsworth Toohey or Peter Keating, or unfortunately largely, Gail Wynand or Dominique through much of the novel, all of whose focus in life is primarily on positioning themselves in some way relative to other people, whether that's beating them or ruling them or having them love you or not being ruled by them, right? Whatever the focus, it's all about how you exist in relation to others. As against, for Roark, it's about the thing he wants to make, to bring into the world, right? The dent he wants to make in the universe, quoting Steve Jobs, who I think is another, a real life exemplar of a builder, okay? And it's the value that he wants to bring into the world through his work, right? Through his choice of how he spends his time and energy, and what's possible to him and what's worth it for him within the scope of his life, right? To recall, I think it's worth quoting this one bit of the Fountainhead, kind of where Roark basically articulates the whole builder's mindset in his explanation to the dean for why he doesn't mind being expelled and in fact kind of prefers it at this point, right? He says, I have, let's say, 60 years to live. Most of that time will be spent working. I've chosen the work I want to do. If I find no joy in it, then I'm only condemning myself. By the way, the 60 years, I hope for a lot of us now is just journalistically a concrete difference in kind of, the span that we can be planning for, but that can also vary widely, and we plan individually based on our, projections of kind of the time we have and what's possible to us in that time. Right? If I find no joy in it, I'm only condemning myself to 60 years of torture. And I can find the joy only if I do my work in the best way possible to me. But the best is a matter of standards, and I set my own standards, which is really critical, right? So with this approach, Roark is blasting through a very common false alternative, which I write about in my work on the builder's mindset, between what I've come to call the drill sergeant and the Zen master approach, which are imperfect shorthands for what I think are common patterns that we see psychologically in people who've internalized certain implicit premises that differ, from Roark's own. Okay, we can see how Roark sometimes works himself incredibly hard. Right, he stays in his office days and nights on end till he physically collapses on his desk, and then he gets up and just keeps drafting or keeps visiting the tables of his draftsmen and making notes as if he never even fell asleep. And he throws away sketch after sketch right into the trash bin, which a lot of people forget that crucial scene, right? Because he wants to get it right. You could say he's being a perfectionist, right? It would be easy to call him a workaholic, kind of seeing some of these concrete ways that he drives himself and his team. And it's the same sort of workaholism you might think that leads to burnout and misery in the workplace, right? And that has real costs for personal well-being. But I actually don't think that that's at all like what Roark is doing when he works himself really hard. Okay? I think it's really qualitatively different, and we can see it in the particulars of his own internal dialogue and in his reasons why, and in the context in which he's working hard. We also see that at times he's willing to sit about idly waiting for the right kind of commission, right? He's willing to rest. He's willing to take breaks. He's willing to lie there watching blades of grass and just mindfully noticing how they move without seemingly a care in the world about the past or the future or when the next commission will come in, which doesn't look at all like your traditional workaholic, right? And which we might imagine inserting ourselves into those circumstances that we might flog ourselves and feel guilty that we're not doing more, and then try to busy ourselves with something that feels productive so that we think that, we feel as if we're living up to some sort of standard of productiveness. But he doesn't have any of that. He's not trying to satisfy some external mandate for what it looks like to be Howard Roark. He's doing the things he thinks are going to serve his aims, whatever that may be. And often that means working incredibly doggedly hard because it's really demanding what he wants to do. It's ambitious work, and he loves his work, unconflictedly loves it. And that's the only reason he does it, not for the sake of any further duty, right? But for that life that he wants to fill with work worth doing on his own terms. So this really sets him apart, both from the workaholics and perfectionists among us, or within us, who set standards or who are beholden to standards that have been kind of set for us by some conventional drill sergeant-like authority, rather than by our own judgment of what our life and our valued projects require. And it equally sets him apart from the kind of defensive, reactive, Zen-like approach that we sometimes might resort to as a coping strategy, when borne down against by the drill sergeant, right, where we might detach ourselves from the work, kind of focus on the process, don't worry too much about the outcome. Roark is heck of worried about the outcome. I don't just say hell of a worried about the outcome. I'm like censoring myself, I don't know, right? He wants his buildings to be great. He is holding them to exceptionally high standards, right? And remember, he will only be happy doing the best work possible to him. He's deeply, emotionally, spiritually invested in having his buildings erected his way. And it hurts when they get mangled and butchered, right? I mean, to the point where, I don't want to spoil everything in case anyone here hasn't read the book, but it kind of leads us to a really important culminating event where Roark really kind of acts on, his dedication to and his love of his buildings done right, done his way. It matters to him. The way Austin Heller puts it, right, where he regards his buildings as, quote, the combination of Holy Sacrament, Indian torture, and sexual ecstasy. So he cares, and not in a Zen way, right? So if your experience is anything like mine, you might find the ideal of Roark not only inspiring, but perhaps also somewhat intimidating. It's rare, and it's really hard growing up in our culture for real people, not, for the fictionalized portrayal that Rand, designed Roark to be, but for real people growing up today, to avoid entirely the kind of internalization of some of these mindsets that are counter to the builder's mindset, but also, to really internalize this ideal that's so rarely presented to us in our culture. And most of us have imbibed a mix of premises and mindsets and habits and, approaches to living life. And that also extends to how we respond to that deep inspiration, that deep resonance that we feel when we first encounter Roark. One example that's so common, I feel like it bears mentioning, is when we take Roark as our latest drill sergeant. Now, we've encountered this really inspiring ideal, and now we imbue in a very concrete way, the particular example of this ideal, which is this fictionalized man who is an architect and knows what he wants to do from early on, maybe even down to the fact of his orange hair. But to whatever extent we kind of take it literally and we think, well, that's what it looks like to live up to this ideal. So now I have to know what I want to do by the age of 19, or else I'm off track. I'm not living up to the ideal. So either I need to kind of push myself into something that may actually not be, my kind of favorite line of work, or may not serve me in the long run, and then kind of rigidly maintain that course, or I get stuck and I flog myself constantly for the fact that I haven't yet figured out what I want to do, and I'm not living up to as if Roark would, assume about anyone else. Dominique, for instance, who really doesn't have it figured out, right at the point where they meet and fall in love, as if he would assume that everyone should be on the same path that he's on, right? That's, if you think about it, that's the opposite of the builder's mindset. But it's so easy for us to do, and it's so tempting, particularly when the drill sergeant still lives in us, and it gets meshed together with this new ideal that we've discovered and really want to live up to. So this stuff is really hard, but crucially, it's achievable. I've spent, again, the roughly 2 decades that I have cultivating it in myself, cultivating it in my clients, seeing the efforts by which people come to embody this mindset more and more. I've seen many, many real life exemplars of this mindset, whether in whole or in part, whether implicitly or explicitly, and I know that, I know now they exist not just in fiction, right? And I've seen it grow within myself, and I know it's all the more possible now that we all have this guidepost to return to, again and again, whenever we need it. I go back and I reread the Fountainhead when I face a difficult choice, an important juncture in my life, and I invite you all to do the same. Thank you so much. I think we have 7-ish minutes for questions, unless you want to go over a little. All right, fine. I'll take it.
And questions are being recorded, so repeat them like it's going to
Will do. Wait, we don't have until 1? No?
we should actually.
You're trying to cheat me of my time? What is this for? You cheated me of the first 3 minutes to begin with, and look, I still managed to come in with 7 to spare. Good. Well, now I've cheated us all of another 1 or 2, but for real this time. All right. I am open and welcoming of your questions. Yes. Hey, Kirk.
So you emphasized the quote, I set my own standards, and I was just wondering, how do you think maybe that's really important for this mindset, how does one develop standards that are truly one's own?
That's an excellent question. I mean, I think the first step is realizing that's a question. That's not an easy thing to do, right? And especially when we get into like domain-specific standards. I mean, I think it's demanding work intellectually to understand and to kind of validate for yourself any given standard at any level of sort of generality or abstraction, including, again, the principles of objectivism that you might be inspired to, emulate. But it takes years of study to really get it. And I feel like there are certain ones I'm only just starting to get it. There's a whole course of study at the ARU that can help you in that endeavor, right? But when it comes to more domain-specific standards, like what does it look like to do good programming, or what does it look like to be, to write a good essay, or to be, kind of progressing at the pace I want to be progressing in my field of study or in sports or, or whatever it is, there's work involved, right? And there's data gathering and iteration involved in answering that kind of question for yourself and in developing those standards. And it's extremely contextual. And that's where I think it's so helpful to have the kind of example of, okay, Roark is thinking about it in the context of his life and the time he has and the resources at his disposal. Like if he were alive today, maybe he wouldn't have chosen architecture. Maybe he would be in AI, right? Or maybe he would be, or some kind of, he would be creating 3D, like digital VR representations of worlds that he helps, who knows, right? And there would be a kind of Wild West out there, as in some ways there was at the time. It was worse than the Wild West. It was, the classicist, whatever backward time where people are all clinging to an old standard, right? But there would be a lot of thinking through kind of like, well, what would it take for me to actually master this skill to a sufficient degree that I can like build this type of product or service? And there you talk to people who are doing it, whose work you admire. You try to really understand, what was their kind of self-education like, or what kinds of experiences have they had that have brought them to where they are today, where they're making something that you find really useful and beautiful, which often will be a first, benchmark for developing standards, right? And it's also going to highly depend on your goal. So, I work with founders a lot, with entrepreneurs who are building companies that are, especially to the extent that they're, let's say, consumer-oriented, companies. The standard will have to include the user, the customer, the client. What does the client want? What do people want? Build something people want, right? This is a mantra by, people in the startup world, from Steve Jobs to Paul Graham, and a lot of really thoughtful people who also write about, kind of their own thinking about how they've come to their standards of what's good, how they decide who to invest in. You ingest a lot of that information, a lot of your own observations, a lot of other people's perspectives, which you then think about critically and independently and kind of, put to your own test, right? And decide, kind of what makes sense to you and what doesn't, and what are you sure of and what is more of a hypothesis. And you kind of test and iterate on that process and try to get to first principles, which I write about and I think is a really key differentiator of Roark and of kind of real life ambitious builders, that they really try to go deep in identifying insights at a level that will endure over time and will apply to a lot of the things in their field, and will kind of simplify, like Jeff Bezos, his insight that, look, customers will always want cheaper over pricier. They'll always want faster over slower. Like, these are things that we can always, given the nature of our business, we're trying to get people things that they want in a quick, efficient way through the internet. We can use those two simple benchmarks, and in particular, customer obsession is one of his principles, and that can guide us in a lot of different decisional contexts where it feels like the most important thing is outcompete Google at any cost. We need to be better than Google, or most important thing is to raise this big kind of round of funds so that we can feel really secure in our position. But actually, no, is that going to help us to be fast and cheap for our customers? If I can't trace the causal connection between this sub goal and that ultimate aim, the thing that makes us good, the thing that gives us our purpose, then it's probably a distraction. So those are just thinking out loud, a few ideas to consider. Yes.
One clue to get to Roark's psychology and how he handles adversity. There's a line that goes something like, a pain that only goes down to here.
Yes.
I've heard it described as Roark is metaphysically happy. And
Resilient.
Which is kind of a difficult thing for many of us to achieve in
Indeed.
life. But
Indeed.
Any thoughts on that, how one achieves that? Because I can imagine all of us have dealt with adversity at some level.
Yes. So these are great questions that tempt me to go on far beyond my allotted now 1 minute. The question is, how do we emulate Roark's, I would call it maybe psychological resilience, where, even the worst setbacks, the worst pain just goes down to a certain point, beneath which all there is just this knowledge that, I am the man who is capable of building these buildings and of living, the knowledge of kind of who he is and what's possible to him. And I would say it's a long process, for most of us who don't have that kind of resilience to that degree. And it involves internalizing some of the sorts of principles that we've been talking about here through real life kind of action-based experimentation that builds our confidence and kind of builds our benevolence and builds our self-esteem over time. So I would say there's no shortcut to going out and kind of proving it to ourselves on the ground again and again, and kind of building up that internal reservoir of certainty or trust. All right, am I going to get cut off now?
So